Great. So we've prepared some questions that we think might be interesting to our audience and be relevant to both of you based on some of the sort of similarities and differences in your work and the fact that you're both working with machine learning. One thing that I noticed in the work that both of you showed today was that there's a similar focus on emergence, whether it's through artificial life or organic life, and a sort of sense of scale being very different in the work, right? So we have, on the one hand, with Casey, we have work that's using very simple parametric systems to generate complexity, and then we also have something that is also probably a very simple parametric system in a certain sense, although we can't be totally sure of that, right? With the organic materials that you're working with, Jenna. So I was wondering, what is it like to work with these kind of very simple parameters, and does it kind of change your perception, or what kind of worlding or perception are you doing differently as a result of working, with emergent life forms? Is this something that changes how you see the world at large?
Yeah, I don't know, with the idea of emergence, years ago I was reading 5 or 6 Easy Pieces, the Feynman book. Does anybody know? Anyway, it's a series of diagrams of molecules for water molecules. And so it's really simple diagrams of, as water, sort of how the molecules align, as steam, and as ice. And sort of that diagram just triggered, this idea and this interest in working with these elements that are very, very simple, but through changes in the environment or changes to the basic simple elements, like a whole world of structure, form, and sort of an entire environments can be created. And so for me, that was the trigger. It was sort of this fundamental idea about how the world operates, and maybe instead of making abstractions of how the world looks, it was this desire to make abstractions of how life and how sort of the natural world operates. And that was one of the original ways into that kind of working.
Okay, now, kind of similar curiosities, and I think it's also this attempt to develop kind of new sensibilities for novel experience also, and not meaning only technologies, but also microbes and bacteria, for example, that are such a big part of us. That, yes, this curiosity of kind of sensing the environment that's in a constant dialogue with us as well.
Okay, one more thing? Yeah, of course. Yeah, one more thing about that is this idea of working in a way with things that are really outside of myself and sort of things that are semi-automatic or a little bit out of control. And rather than sort of, I draw a box and a box is there, I don't really want to be in control. I want to be more harnessing things and pushing and pulling things that have a sense of their own, but then I'm constructing the fundamental system, sort of. So it's working back and forth. It's a lot of ideas promoted in the middle 20th century by John Cage and other people, sort of working in that environment where we can set up a structure and let things happen.
And for me also to add to this, that having worked with language a lot, but then obviously not sharing language with my microbial collaborators, and then I've tried to find ways of sensing or communicating beyond language, or at least attempt to break language down, even though I know it's a slightly impossible project as a human, but that has been also this kind of motivation to try to get some other kind of input, some other minds involved in the project.
There's a specter of the alien, I think, in all of what we're talking about here, right? And sort of what one of the things that kind of came to me while watching all of this work is that there's a relationship sort of between the system and meaning, and often literal meaning isn't what's being produced from the system, but a sort of encounter with an incomprehensibility or another type of meaning. And it seems that you're both, Casey, you just mentioned that you're seeking out lack of control or a sort of otherness or an alien or something to react to you, to change how you, to produce novelty in your own artistic process, I guess. Is that correct? Okay, and Jenna, I feel like you're also, you're producing these It was funny, just I was thinking about this morning, we were going from these very clear arguments about the nature of artificial intelligence and its situatedness, and then when we go into this sort of creative expression of it, we're seeing a lot of the alien actually reflected back at us. Is that part of your motivation for, is that a goal for you?
I guess also trying to communicate with machines in their terms, not anthropomorphizing them too much. I guess that's some kind of a goal, to get to know them better. Yes, and like I mentioned in the presentation, I feel like the computers are in a way the aliens of our own creation in some way, that we programmed them, but now they're doing something slightly strange sometimes. Like, for example, the soundtrack in the Nimia Seti video, or the sounds in it were made using, I fed this Martian text that I read, and then these bacterial movements, and then it was Memo Actens developed this GRANMA, this granular neural network for sound production, and what came out sounded so haunting and strange. I could have, and very hive-like, I felt, and what I basically, it could have been anything, but it was kind of like beautiful and very haunting.
One thing I'm interested in, because obviously, in a way, you spend like a lot of time around machines or other life forms, or I guess, Casey, you've been involved in this for a very long time, and Jenna, it's like a natural progression of the work that you've been doing with Subtaclus. I can't quite say it. Sometimes I can say it. But I was wondering, I mean, just in terms of like that developing relationship, what kind of, like, how do you refer to that? Do you see it as a kind of stewarding, fathering, mothering, like friendship? Like what, like when you're spending time and you're like, oh, it produced something new, what is that? How would you describe that? Do you have a sense of that? Or is it just simply a tool? It's just something that is literally something you pick up and use?
I don't think of it as a tool, but I think of it more as a medium, definitely. A medium, like a connection between things and something to be explored, rather than, I think of more of a tool as a sort of having a means to an end. Faltering with the rest.
I think I call it collaboration usually. Of course, you could say that's slightly problematic, because I know there's no way for the microbes to speak back and agree to this collaboration. But what I essentially do is I feel like I make stages for their performances, for example, or use my own body as a sort of vehicle for their performance in the case of the slime mold, and let them do their thing. So in a way, create like an environment or architecture for the microbes.
And I guess a lot of this is kind of contingent on chance scenarios. And if we think about it in terms of a medium, like throughout artistic history, it's, you know, people create rules that then produce systems, or you know, abstract expressionism, you use paint in a certain way. Like, what is it about this that is different to that in terms of like randomness, chance, it kind of living as its own entity, particularly if you describe it specifically as a medium?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that, you know, over the years I've made a lot of different work. Some of it is based in just rolling a dice, kind of old-fashioned chance operations work. But I think the working with A-life ideas, or working with emergence more directly, is there's more structure to it, and there's oftentimes like multiple layers of systems that flow up. Sort of this idea of cells and constructing tissues, constructing organs, and I feel that there's more ability to, it's more about authorship and less about chance at that point.
And there's a lot of, at least in my case with the machine learning project, there's a lot of, well, there's always the selection of materials. That's a significant point, and then there's also the editing afterwards. So for example, the sounds are selection still, so it's, even though it applies to a lot of, even the fact that the video is actually 12 minutes has like a technical reason behind it, but still I feel like there's always this framing and editing and sort of communicating that happens well before and after the process.
I think one thing that's really, for me, essential about this work are these feedback loops and the idea of iteration, that you set something up, and if the result is, I don't know, it's just you kind of intuitively, you then modify it and then run it again, and then days and months later, you have something that you feel is you're feeling something with, or you feel is like operating according to some sort of vague aspiration that you had the work to do. This idea that it's not just like once and chance, but it's a long process of constructing the system through a series of trees and operations over time.
You both mentioned, well, maybe Casey, you might not have mentioned it, but I know that you've been working with He-Min. Is that your
with Heyman.
Heyman, that's right. And you mentioned Memo, Acton, and Damien Henri. So you've both been working with others in producing this work, and it's certainly common for artists to do that. But do you feel that there's anything different about working with ML systems that requires a different type of knowledge, or that has fundamentally changed in the way that you collaborate with another person?
Definitely. So for example, in my case, when it comes to machine learning, I didn't have the technical skills to realize it in a way that felt meaningful. But this was a topic that I was kind of looking at from a conceptual or like theoretical point of view. So it was like a significant. It had a significant effect on my working also, and just to also having the possibility to work with not only one person but two experts in the topic. You could sort of have a better understanding of what's actually interesting to do technically speaking, and not only conceptually speaking, which was very formative.
One thing I'm thinking of is there's just there's a heavy load in like learning how to use these systems at all, and it almost would consume almost all of one's time to be able to do that. But at the same time, to be an artist collaborating with engineers, and I'm often in the role of supporting those projects, I observe that there are almost entire worlds that can be consumed in understanding one system or being a practicing artist. So I just wonder if the sort of level of complexity that these tools are reaching might infer some new model of how we might need to work together to use these systems creatively.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking, like, it's really pragmatically, as I mentioned in the presentation, I've been making work with code for about 20 years. I wasn't able to understand the machine learning systems well enough to use them. And so instead I collaborated with a really talented, like, current MFA student that I'm working with who's a computer science undergrad. And collaborating with Heyman really allowed me to start making work in this way. And to be also, just to be honest, we were working with it for about 5 months before we saw any results. We had failure after failure after failure. And it really, I think the systems are so complex, they can't really be explained in a really precise way at all the way down. For me, it took time to develop an intuition for how they operated. So like in developing the training data, how to construct those pictures so that they will produce images that are like I'm able to like understand the connection between those things. So it was really technically challenging. Took months of effort.
Yeah, I feel it's like living material in the same way as slime mold is living material, that it doesn't do exactly what you want it to do, but it might do something way better or way worse. but it's interesting to me from that
I think it's also like a nature of the newness of this, and like thinking back to what it was like to be an artist working with code in the 1990s versus what it's like in 2018. I have a feeling that there's a lot of good systems for working with machine learning at a surface level where you can get a room full of people working with it over a workshop in a few hours, but to really get into the like level of detail where you're doing your own training and you're modifying the code for producing different quality of results, then that's where it gets really complicated really fast.
Or narrating a different set of relations, or being able to do narrative. And I mean, like, that's one thing I see in your work, Jenna, is that you're able to imbue a lot of meaning into a sort of neural net system, whereas we're seeing a lot of artwork that doesn't necessarily speak to external relations, but really dives deep into the materiality of ML itself and generativity.
Yeah, and it's the same. I kind of, I guess, with working with biological materials, there's also a lot of so-called bioart that's basically focusing on the materiality. But I guess for me, it's always about the narratives first and foremost.
I mean, I'm kind of loath to ask this question, but it does kind of seem necessary in some ways, of like your reference to 90 and the reference to kind of bioart. And there's been a couple of like pieces published in mainstream kind of arts journalism recently. There's like kind of speculating of how, I think you know what I'm talking. There's kind of, one, you have this auction at Sotheby's or Christie's where you've got this auctioning of an artwork and et cetera, and it kind of brings, money will always bring that conversation to the foreground. But the question is like, is this some kind of emerging movement? And that's maybe the question I don't necessarily want to ask, but I think it's the one that like always ends up getting asked when you see the emergence of something. Like we saw this in post-internet, but there's also, I guess there's like interesting kind of like connection to net art, because potentially it's more than a movement, right? Because you're seeing within different artistic practices that everybody is having to respond to artificial intelligence, whether it's through narrative, whether it's like using ML, whether it's like producing anonymous identities that then produce artworks, etc. And I just wondered, I mean, there's a lot kind of there, but I imagine that you're both like pretty aware of the emergence of those discussions. So, maybe just respond, or I can narrow the question.
I can maybe narrow it down for you, because I was thinking about this question that we discussed, and I was wondering, is it a movement, or is it, as you were saying, a medium or media, that might, is it possible to put a cohesive wrapper around ML-enabled artwork, or is it really just like talking about photography or video, where there's no singular video art per se, I mean, right now it's very new, so we have that sense that there might be some kind of movement, but obviously that can't stay that way forever. It's going to infuse itself into everything, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm teaching a graduate seminar this quarter about the history of video art, and so I've been reading a lot about that. It's a really good one to bring up, because when that started to emerge, like really strongly in the 1970s, there was this idea of video art, but even at that time, a lot of artists and curators understood that term made no sense, because it encompassed every kind of artistic practice. Political practice, social practice, aesthetic practice, formalism, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't really think it makes sense to talk about it as one thing. Like as you mentioned, it's affecting poetry, writing. It's been affecting music for a longer time, I think, than anything. Architecture, like our practices are very different, but there's a strong affinity with them as well. I mean, that one reason I wanted to talk about, like, really narrowly about GANs and DC GANs specifically today was just to try and dig into like one unit of it in a little bit more depth, because I think that it is such a broad term.
I'd also rather see it as a medium than like a genre.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, the reason why I'm quite excited about it is that it can produce all these different outcomes. So on one hand, because if you think about like net art and things like this in the 90s, they had a very particular aesthetic and a very particular politics, whereas any work with artificial intelligence, particularly like GANs, is that they can produce something that no one knows, and maybe it's not important for them to know. Like particularly some of the images that you showed, Casey, like they show a kind of like, you know, you don't need to tell anybody that they're artificial intelligence. You produce an image in the same way as you potentially produce a painting, and I think that that's like a super kind of interesting trajectory for the production of artwork going into the future.
And also what we talked about recently about, does it need to be technically real?
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's exactly,
fiction?
you don't need to say whether you actually, well, I think that's where like some of the battle lines will be drawn. You're already starting to see this in terms of like people that really understand technically how things are done, and then the more kind of conceptual bending of the technology.
That's a good point. As far as the movement goes, I think the thing that might be different is that there's so much engineering often involved. So if there is a sort of new movement, it has this engineering aspect to it, which is kind of what would differentiate it, right? It's that need to do all that engineering work. But yeah, I think you do see a lot of, I mean, there are a lot of AI artworks out there that are of questionable AI veracity, and that's an interesting part of the movement, I guess.
And of course, when you do work with the materials and work with the programmers, you get really into these technical details, and you're like, okay, I can't obstruct it. That's what it wants to say, or it somehow you get really attached to certain things in the process, but yeah, those things might not communicate to anyone else.
And I guess maybe to address some of the critique of artist engagement with technologies, do you think that it is possible that these artistic collaborations with AI could be a model for future AIs that we collaborate with on a much broader scale? To get a little bit science fiction about it, like, are we modeling the future by creating AI collaborative artworks? And if so, will the AIs look back at us and be grateful that that's what we did?
I mean, I hope not. My honest answer. Yeah.
Why not?
I feel like the future might be with these microbes, so I've tried to play my part with the slime mold wisely, so it will hopefully protect me in the future.
Okay. I think we've got to wrap it up there. Thank you guys for your presentations and for the conversation.
Thank you.